In contrast to Sam's experience, it was only in this afternoon's sessions that I started to feel some coherence entering at least my mind about what we were up to here. And for me, the testimonies of practitioners and present-day observers was quite visceral, and I have been trying since then to think like an historian about how we can build a bridge between the more purely historical papers that we heard yesterday and this morning and the sessions this afternoon. And when I say think like an historian, I mean think about not just cherry-picking lineages, but actually considering which examples can shed light on the fate of rights movements in various settings and how that might deepen the conversation about issues in Israel today that were so riveting in these last two panels. So I've been thinking about two historical examples, neither of which I'm an expert on, but which struck me as pertinent to that effort. The chief thing that I had found surprising about the conference up until this afternoon was how little attention there was to efforts to articulate human rights in specifically Jewish idioms, given the subject of the conference and the setting of the conference. As Sam said, it really started out on a very international note, and it was only when we got to the afternoon's panels that we started to hear from people who were talking about the act of translation of human rights idioms into something like a vernacular. Now, in part because of Sam's own work, which has made it extremely risky to lean on bogus genealogies of human rights that purport to find their sources in the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament or the Quran or any of the other dozens and dozens of supposedly antique ancient traditions that have been cast as the wellsprings for this way of thinking, despite the way that he has upped the risk factor for doing that. When I think about some of the examples in which human rights have been successfully appropriated, and by the way, that has never taken the form of a mass movement. There's never been a mass human rights movement. It's always been a program, relatively speaking, of elites. But there have been instances in which human rights discourse has been extremely effectively appropriated and embedded or adapted to local situations in ways that have given it traction, and it got me thinking in light of what was said this afternoon. And one of them, Sam himself has shed considerable light on, and that is the appropriation of human rights discourse in the world of conservative Catholic thought in the interwar period. If there was ever an arena where you thought international human rights, as bequeathed to us by the militantly secular French Revolution, would not find a hospitable welcome, it's the Catholic Church. And yet, in the 1920s and 30s, we find a virtual about-face in the Church's relationship with the idea of the rights of the individual and the sacrality of human dignity as articulated by various adapted human rights norms. So this is an example in which human rights as a language was translated into, well, since it's the Catholic Church, we can't call it the vernacular, but into another language, into another idiom, and appropriated in very, very powerful ways that probably had a shaping influence on the most successful institutionalization of human rights in the world today, which is in the European setting, in the European community, and then in the European Union. And this is not, I think, something you could call a post-liberal approach or a post-liberal appropriation. This is a completely unanticipated act of translation into a much more ancient, if anything, pre-liberal idiom. The other example I want to just call to your attention is not really an act of translation, but it's something telling and I think by analogy possibly useful. What we often refer to as the American Civil Rights Movement really started out as a human rights movement in the 1940s. and that history was suppressed in the wake of the Cold War, and instead an idiom that drew on international, let's just say foreign-born versions of rights, indigenized itself and found extraordinarily powerful expression in the American civil religion, and was able to articulate its ideas and its demands for change in what felt like an extremely homegrown idiom. For an historian, there are many things that could be critiqued about the accuracy or the honesty of that move. But what cannot be denied is its power and its effectiveness. In the United States today, there are all kinds of myths about what happened, the achievements of the civil rights movement, or for that matter, the achievements of the abolitionist movement. Somebody recently had to point out in the New York Times that the abolitionist movement did not succeed on its own in abolishing slavery. It took this little thing called a civil war, which was the deadliest war in American history. But the mobilization of the myth of drawing on indigenous sources, if we abolish slavery, surely we can abolish Jim Crow, proved extremely effective. When Amnesty International was founded in 1961, Peter Benison said that 100 years ago, slavery was abolished in both the United States and in Russia. He was trying to milk the centenary to give more power to Amnesty's founding. And he said, surely if we were able to free the body from coercive labor 100 years ago, the time has come to free the mind, and hence the campaign on behalf of prisoners of conscience. He too left out the fact that it took a civil war in the American case and a military defeat in the Russian case in the Crimean War to really put an end to slavery and serfdom in those two societies. Nonetheless, despite what you could call the historical fiction of that genealogy, it proved exceptionally powerful and exceptionally motivating. So for me, the conference has landed on an interesting point this afternoon in the descriptions of attempts to do something analogous in the Israeli case, to draw on more indigenous idioms for the purposes of translating and more effectively creating roots for something resembling human rights. I recognize that this presents a problem for the non-Jewish minorities in Israel who have a different set of sources that could be mobilized for this purpose. So I'm not offering this as a solution to the problem, but simply as an observation that might draw a connection between the purely historical papers that we heard and what was for me the very poignant testimony by human rights activists telling us about the deadness of the ears that they have encountered, the absence of real interlocutors, and the sense of complete isolation in their own society. Thank you.
Okay.